Thank you very much for joining this video. I want to talk to you today about hot water tank rentals. You know, it used to be hot water tank rentals fell into one of two categories. They were either what we'll call a rental or what we'll call a lease. And the difference was that a rental was typically month to month and a lease was typically long term. And in fact, there was a lot of problem because there was third-party companies, a lot of them, going door to door, knocking on people's door and saying, how much do you pay rental for your hot water tank? Oh, we can do better than that. And then get them to sign a contract at a lower fee. But what they didn't realize is they were signing a contract for 14, 15 years, and they were agreeing to pay that rental amount under the lease agreement for that period of time. And so if they were going with the energy provider, and it was typically Enbridge, they would normally be on a rental and it could be terminated with 1 month notice. Whereas if they're on a third party agreement, it was a lease and it was long term. And so when a realtor went to list the property, he had to determine, first of all, is the hot water tank owned or is it rented? And then he had to determine, is it rented on a month to month basis by the utility company or is it rented on a lease long term? And in fact, way back then, on our listing agreements, there was provision there for was it rental or was it a lease? Well, over time, Enbridge came along with a realization that they were losing a lot of money compared to these third party, and so they changed their policy and they started making theirs long-term as well. So even if you had a hot water tank that was rented through the utility provider, generally Enbridge, you were still locked in, and they usually worked on either a 14 or 15 year term. So that if after 3 or 4 years in, you wanted to get rid of the hot water tank because you wanted an owned one, they would require you to pay the full payment amount times 12 times the number of years. It could be very, very expensive terminating that agreement. What's happened recently is Enercare, or Enbridge, has turned their rental agreements over to Enercare. And so now homeowners are getting two bills, one for the utility and one for the rental of the hot water tank. And it really underscores the fact that they're paying for a rental and how much they are actually paying month to month. And it was becoming a serious problem. And so the government intervened in 2024, and this is important, I'll explain why in a minute. The government intervened and they said, you are no longer allowed to register a notice of security interest for a hot water tank rental. In other words, if you have an agreement that you've signed, you can no longer register it on title. Didn't mean you weren't bound by the agreement. You can still be bound by that agreement. If you signed a contract, you're bound by the contract. But the contract no longer tied in with the title of the property. Some of you have been involved in houses that have solar panels. Generally speaking, those solar panels are on a long-term contract, and those are registered against the title of the property. And when somebody buys the property, they have to assume that agreement. Not so any longer with your security interest when it comes to hot water tanks. And even if it was registered on title, it's no longer enforceable. So I got a call this week from an agent who got a call from their client. They'd sold the property and it closed about a month ago. And suddenly the client received in the mail a bill from Enercare for the rental of the hot water tank. This was a shock to them. They thought when they bought the property, they bought the hot water tank. They were unaware of any rental. So they checked the listing, they checked the agreement of purchase and sale, no reference to rental at all. And they said, we don't want a rental hot water tank. We want to own our own hot water tank. Not happy at all. So the first thing that is important to understand here is that it's not enforceable to the new owner. It's not tied into the title of the property. So they didn't agree to assume it. They didn't sign a new contract, and therefore it's not enforceable. Even if it had been on the contract and the lawyer admits it wouldn't have mattered because under this new provision, it's no longer enforceable. Now, the supplier will try and enforce it. When they call up to try and get out of the contract, the provider, it could be Enercare, could be a third party, you're going to say, oh no, you're bound by it, it's tied in with the title of the property, you agreed to assume it, you assume the property, and that you need to hold firm. Say, absolutely not, I never signed a contract with you, I never agreed to assume the existing contract, I don't want the hot water tank. But you're going to get some pushback from it. But understand that now it's under the notice of security interest, they no longer can enforce it. It's important to understand. And so this could be, it's a mistake, and it could be a costly mistake. There's not only the cost of replacing a water tank, there's also the cost of the balance of the lease and somebody's enforcing it. So in the case I referenced where the agent calls me, what should be done? Well, the new homeowner first needs to understand that the mistake was made in the listing and the agreement of purchase and sale, and the seller and the agent are going to have to come up with some way of making that good, but the buyer is not under obligation to assume that hot water tank. So they need to contact the seller and the seller agent, and through their buyer agent, I suspect, and say, listen, we didn't agree to this. We don't want it. We want that hot water tank out and replaced with one that we own. Then they need to contact the supplier, and they're going to get pushback, but they need to make it clear, we didn't sign a contract. It's not enforceable. We're not interested in it. What you did with the former owner is between you and the former owner. We'll drain the tank. We'll disconnect the tank. We'll make available a time that's convenient for you. We want you to come in and take out the tank. Then call a plumber and have them install a new tank that's owned. And it's not going to be necessarily cheap. I had a rental, and a couple of weeks ago, I had Enercare contact me, and they said, we want to swap out the hot water tank. I said, why are you doing that? And they said, well, it's 21 years old. And I said, well, listen, don't put a new one in. We'll just disconnect that one, and I'll buy one myself. Well, and they didn't give me any pushback at that point. And so I did buy one, and the plumber charged me $2,300. It wasn't cheap. You may have shopped around and get somebody cheaper to install it. Good plumber, so I'm happy to use him. But somebody, it's going to be the realtor and the homeowner, is going to assume the cost of putting in a new hot water tank, and they're also going to have to negotiate with Enercare or whoever, because they're still under contract between the homeowner that sold the house and the provider. And I hope that makes sense. I think it's important to us as realtors. I talked to a lawyer about this recently. I said, you run across it? He said, all the time. So you're going to run across it. And I think a lot of realtors, early on in their career, make a mistake and end up buying a hot water tank. Hopefully we understand, but I think when you're representing the buyer and the buyer gets caught and never signed a contract, it's important to understand that the contract with the previous owner isn't enforceable on the new buyer. I want to thank you very much for your time. Look forward to talking to you again next week.